it's Fern Ellen. So today I'm filming a unsolved murder case, and this is the case of Dorothy Jane Scott. Okay, so I used a variety of sources for this case. Strangely, I hadn't actually heard of it before. I mean, there's a website that I go on to find the most interesting unsolved murders and solved murders, and it's just Wikipedia. You can have it in like dates, so you can look at cases that happened in the 1980s, 1970s, 60s, so on and so forth. And I randomly came across this case, and strangely I hadn't actually heard about it, even though when I put it into Google it is a massively talked about case, and so many other YouTubers have filmed videos on this case, so I was surprised that I hadn't actually came across it until I started researching it. So I always use Wikipedia just to get the facts, the basic information, just some key dates, and just to get an overview. I read through it to decide whether it's a case that I would like to research into, whether I'd like to film a video on. I do know that Wikipedia is not always 100%, so I do obviously use backup sources. One of the other main websites that I actually used for this one was truecrimediva.com. So I hadn't actually used this before at all, but it was really helpful. It kind of, all of the sources that I read, it kind of pulled everything together into one website, and it was just so easy to kind of get an overview and to get the details as well. So that is a really good website to use. And then just before I start, a little disclaimer: I never mean any offence about any of the people involved, any of the people affected, directly, indirectly. I don't mean offence if I pronounce names wrong or just at all. I'm just compiling information that I found from different websites on a case that I think you would all be interested in. So as always, I'm going to start with some key facts about Dorothy. Okay, so her full name was Dorothy Jane Scott. She was born on April the 23rd, 1948. She lived in Stanton, California, and she lived with her 4-year-old son, Sean. She was described as an amazing mother, completely devoted to her family, deeply religious, very generous, very giving lady. She was just such a family person. She very rarely went out on dates. Her dad said that if she went out, it was very few times since splitting up with her ex-husband. So yeah, she spent most of her time with Sean or at work. She worked as a secretary in actually her dad's store, I believe. It was a psych shop. I think it definitely has, it's closed down now, but it was a psych shop, and I think there was also like a head shop kind of joined onto it or something like that. And it was called Swingers Psych Shop, so it was a really popular psych shop in California at the time. So she went missing on May the 28th, 1980, and she was last seen by 2 of her friends, Pam and Conrad. And the place in which she went missing was Anaheim. I think I'm pronouncing that correctly. So she was 32 years old when she went missing, and her cause of death is actually unknown. Her body was discovered on August the 6th, 1984. Okay, so let's talk about the day that Dorothy went missing. So as I mentioned, it was May the 28th, 1980. It was actually in the evening. So she went to work at around 9 p.m. for a sort of team meeting with her colleagues. And while she was at that meeting, she noticed that her friend Conrad, who looked a bit ill, a bit funny, something was quite off about him. She also noticed that he had a red streak on him, and it kind of unsettled her. She said we should probably get that looked at. He was unsure as to what had happened himself, so she said, look, I'm going to take you to the hospital, we'll go to the walk-in, we'll find out what's happened, because he wasn't well at all. So Pam, the other colleague that saw her alive, decided to go with them. She tagged along, and they all went to the hospital. So whilst at the hospital, Conrad was being seen to, and Pam and Dorothy were just sitting having a good old chat about life in general, possibly about a strange caller that I'll get onto later. And they were together the whole time, and the only time in which that they were apart was when Dorothy went to the toilet, and that was brief, and then she came straight back. So they spent pretty much every minute in the hospital together. So after some time, Conrad came out. He said, look, I've been bitten by a spider, I'll need to get some medication. So they went over to the pharmacy and they waited for the medication. So it was taking some time, and Dorothy decided that she didn't want Conrad to have to walk to the car, which I'm guessing must have been quite a distance away in the parking lot in his condition, because he still wasn't feeling well. He was still waiting for his prescription. So she said, oh, okay, I'll go get the car. And I believe that was around 11 p.m. that she decided to go and pick up the car and to pick them up closer to the pharmacy. So once they collected the prescription, Conrad and Pam decided to wait outside for Dorothy, and moments later Dorothy's car came at them in high speed. So there is some sources say that they were waiting there a while, some say it was only moments, but they walked out to the car park to see if they could find her, and the car just came flying at them. They thought that was really unusual. They started waving their arms to signal like, hi Dorothy, I'm over here, pull up, pick us up, kind of thing, but she didn't. I say she because we aren't actually sure whether Dorothy was driving or whether it was someone else. It is likely that it was somebody else. This was something really out of character for Dorothy, and I feel like this is a really good time to let you know that she was a very sane person, and most of her friends described her as really quite boring and dull, not in a horrible way, but that she didn't really kind of go off the rails. She wasn't really excited about anything. She was pretty much just family and friend orientated and just loved hanging out with her son Sean. So the headlights were so bright they couldn't see who was driving, and in their head it was Dorothy, and she must have gotten some sort of unexpected call, or there was an emergency at home with Sean, because she sped off out of the car park. She took a sharp right, and the headlights then turned off and she was gone. So they waited around a couple of hours before they actually contacted the police. They did just assume that Dorothy was most likely rushing home to see Sean, and maybe he had an incident or something like that. Sean, by the way, was with Dorothy's parents at the time, Vera and Jacob, and so they were babysitting him. So Pam decided, let's give them a call, see if they've heard from Dorothy, and they didn't. So after a couple of hours they decided, okay, this is really bizarre, we need to call the police and find out what's happened here. The police weren't overly concerned, which you would probably expect, because it had only been a couple of hours since they last seen them. She was 32 years old, she was very much sane, average, normal person. So it was, although out of character, it wasn't sort of too unusual to the police. They thought anything could have happened. She could have gone to meet a friend, she could have went home. There was a whole host of things that she could have done, so they weren't overly sort of concerned about her whereabouts and wanting to kind of put out a full sort of missing persons investigation. Okay, so when it became clear that Dorothy wasn't coming back anytime soon, they began to treat it as a missing persons case. The police advised not to talk to the media. They said to just keep it on the down low so that they could question their sort of, not suspect, but people that were close to Dorothy. She was quite a closed book. She had her mum, her dad, her son, her ex-husband, her friends from work, and other than that she was very much a reserved person. There was no sort of boyfriends or prominent exes or anyone that they expected could have sort of kidnapped, abducted her, so it was quite unusual. So they interviewed Sean's father, her ex-husband, and he had a really strong alibi. He was in Missouri at the time in his home. I believe he lived there at this point, and so it was highly unlikely that he had anything to do with it. They then actually went on to question the employees at the psych shop twice. I couldn't find a reason as to why that they did that twice, whether they believed it was somebody there. I'm not entirely sure, but they interviewed them twice and nothing sort of arose. And then you may think, well, was it a customer, somebody that saw Dorothy perhaps a couple times a week? The police quickly shot down that idea. They said that it was very unlikely to be a customer because Dorothy worked as a secretary in the back office. She was not on a customer facing role. It's unlikely that it could have been somebody just coming into the shop on a day-to-day basis or a weekly basis. They kind of wrote that off quite quickly. So the day after she was reported missing, the 29th of May 1980, her Toyota station wagon was found at 4:30 a.m. on fire 10 miles away from where she was last seen at the hospital. No leads arose from that, other than that they could now guess that something bad was going on, that she was not missing on her own accord. She wouldn't have set her own car on fire, so at this point they were expecting foul play. Okay, so I mentioned how Dorothy was pretty much your average mum, really devoted to her family. She was so religious, she was Christian, she was a lovely, generous person. She did, however, have one sort of darker aspect in her life, and this was a strange caller. To this day, we don't actually know the identity, although some people have taken a guess. The strange caller, I believe it started months and months before she went missing. He was calling her at her place of work, and he wouldn't contact her any other way. So the calls started quite, I wouldn't say normal, but not sort of dangerous. The call started by him saying he was in love with her, he was really happy, and it was obviously unusual behaviour, but it wasn't anything sort of to be scared of. There was no threats, but the calls definitely did take a dark turn. He started to get angry, I guess that she wasn't falling in love with him, and yeah, so that his love wasn't returned. He started to get angry, he started to make threats, he started to be a bit scary, he started to stalk her. He would tell her what she'd been doing that day, what she'd been wearing, key facts about her day, so that he could prove that he was actually around her at all times. He knew what she was doing, what she was getting up to. He also threatened at one point that he would get her alone, cut her up into bits, and sort of spread it around so that no one would ever find her body, which I think is probably the most scariest thing that you could hear from a complete stranger. You don't know their identity, you don't know where they are, whether they're in your friendship group, you literally don't have a clue who they are. And to get that threat, how do you go about protecting yourself? So Dorothy decided that it was too dangerous to just carry on her day-to-day life without doing anything different to sort of defend herself, protect herself. She started taking karate lessons, so self-defense. She wanted to learn how to protect herself. Unfortunately, it hadn't been enough. She did also consider and openly considered getting a handgun, I think because she just was so concerned, so worried about anything happening to herself or her son or her family, that she considered this. But because she was such a devoted mother, the reason that she didn't actually make the purchase was because she was worried about her son finding that gun and injuring himself, which is so sad, that because she was just such a devoted mother, she didn't take necessary steps to protect herself, which could have made such a drastic difference. But of course you can't make any assumptions, you can't sort of guess whether how much more safe that would have made her. She didn't have any sort of physical contact with them. The closest she came to finding out his identity was she received a phone call saying, "Can you come outside?" Once she went outside, I think she was probably curious as to who it was. As she went outside, there was one single red rose on her windshield, and that's probably about as close to contact as she had with her strange mystery caller. So I think it's probably an interesting point to let you know that she did actually say that this voice at the other end of the phone was familiar. It wasn't so familiar that it could have been her best friend or her dad, for instance, but it was more sort of if you've got a friend that you very rarely see, or somebody that you bump into occasionally and you sort of exchange like a very simple, easy conversation with, something like that, something where she knew the voice but couldn't place it because they weren't close enough. Between 1980 and 1984, so between her disappearance and her body being found, Dorothy's mother, Vera, actually received pretty much every Wednesday afternoon, evening, a phone call from this strange caller. So if it had been sort of Dorothy's ex-husband or a distant cousin or uncle or something like that, it is very likely that Dorothy's mother would have recognised that voice, which she didn't. So it's very likely that it was just someone that Dorothy knew away from home and away from her family life. So Vera started to receive these calls from this unknown male. At first he said, "Oh, well, you related to Dorothy? Do you know where she is? Is Dorothy around?" And then the calls started to change drastically into, "I have your daughter," and then later, "I've killed your daughter." And the calls were always really, really short, so the police couldn't sort of, you know, trace it or record it or find out where it came from. And it was very brief conversation, and Vera never managed to get any important details or information out of the strange caller. So on June the 12th, 1980, the mystery caller decided to ring the Orange County Register, which was the local paper, the local news that reported her disappearance. So I did mention earlier that the police suggested that they kept it all out of the media, but Jacob, her father, decided to contact them. He was very concerned. He was in his eyes, the more people that knew about it, the more likely she would turn up. So he did actually contact the media. So yeah, the unidentified strange caller confessed to killing Dorothy. He said the reason that he killed her was because she cheated on him, which is bizarre because she didn't have a boyfriend. None of her colleagues could remember an instance where she could have been meeting a boyfriend. None of her family could. It was very unlikely that this was the case, and that this was probably just a made-up story in this guy's head. Perhaps he sort of had mental problems, or just sort of made it all up and actually started to believe it himself. So you may think, well, perhaps this guy just read the story in the local newspaper and decided to sort of pull someone's leg, pretend that he had killed her for some attention. It is unlikely that this was just a random phone call. It's extremely likely that it's the same person. He could recount details from the day of her disappearance that weren't released to the media, that weren't released to anyone other than family members, and only things that Pam and Conrad actually would know. He knew that Conrad had been to hospital for a spider bite, which is strange because that means he was either in earshot of their conversation, that he was in the hospital somewhere near them, around them at all times, or that Dorothy herself had told him at some point. He also was aware that Dorothy had previously been wearing a black scarf at the meeting and changed it to a red scarf to go to the hospital. No one's really sure why she did that, so I guess it is kind of an unusual, interesting point. But yeah, no one knew why that happened, and the fact that he knew these two key details and where she went missing kind of leads you to believe that this strange caller must have had something to do with it, or perhaps he was stalking her at the time and saw the incident happen. Perhaps he knew a little bit more. I guess we'll never know. So he also said that Dorothy had contacted him from the medical centre, which would explain why he knew about the spider bite. But of course, I mentioned earlier, Pam said she was pretty much always with Dorothy. The only time she wasn't was when she went to the toilet. So it seems kind of unlikely, but not impossible, that Dorothy had actually contacted this strange caller. So the phone calls actually did stop in August 1984, and the reason that we believe this happened was because on this one occasion, Jacob, her father, actually answered the phone. And once they recognised that it was Jacob on the phone and not Vera, the phone line went dead. And to me, that is probably the most obvious point that Jacob knew the strange caller. So because, bringing it back, Jacob was the owner of this psych store, it is likely that he would know all of his colleagues' voices. He would have contact with all of those colleagues quite regularly. That's probably the most likely identity of this mystery caller. But perhaps he used to work at the shop, perhaps he was a friend of Jacob and regularly came into the shop to chat to Jacob, perhaps he lived nearby. You don't know, but to me it's very likely that the mystery caller knew Jacob, because why else would the calls stop and would the calls go dead? He was obviously worried that, I mean, I say obviously, probably worried, he was probably worried that Jacob was going to recognise his voice, find him and find out what had happened to Dorothy, if we are sort of on the assumption that Dorothy and this strange caller were together on the night of her disappearance. So that's obviously, it's not factual, we don't know that they definitely knew each other, we will never know that they definitely knew each other, but in my head that is the case, and pretty much all of the sources I read said something similar. So on August the 6th, 1984, Dorothy's body was actually found. Her body was found by a construction worker, so he'd found various parts of her body, which I won't get into, but one of the parts was her skull. He also found a watch and a ring. The watch was actually stopped at 12:30 a.m. and that was the day, so the morning after she was last seen. So she was seen at 11 p.m. and then at 12:30 a.m, an hour and a half later, her watch was stopped. So it's not a given, but it is likely this was the time of her death, or this was the time of foul play. Perhaps they broke the watch to sort of mislead, I don't know, but her watch was stopped at this time. And the ring that was found was a turquoise ring, and Vera actually identified that this ring did belong to Dorothy. The autopsy then revealed that actually these remains did belong to Dorothy Jane Scott, and so the missing person case actually turned into a homicide. So the remains were verified on August the 14th, and then on August the 22nd they held a memorial service for Dorothy. It's quite sad because at this point, 4 years later after her disappearance, although they got answers, they probably weren't the answers they were hoping for. I'm sure every single person was hoping for Dorothy to return or to be found healthy, and unfortunately that was not the case. And to this day the case remains unsolved, and there were actually no leads and no arrests. So it's a given with every unsolved case. We do hope that at some point we will sort of get an answer, the family will get justice, and it does happen. But the strange thing about this case compared to other unsolved murders is there were no actual leads, no suspects. Usually families of people that have gone missing, or people that have, or families of those that have been murdered, have some sort of idea of who could have done it. They may say, well, this person had an argument with this person last week, could it be them? And there's always some sort of, well, it's unlikely but it could be this. With Dorothy, the only sort of suspect I guess you have is this strange caller whose identity is unknown, and other than that there is no reason as to why somebody would want to hurt Dorothy in any way, because she was just such a lovely person. There was no sort of negativity in her life. She didn't really do anything wrong. But then again, the two may not be linked. The strange caller may not be the person that murdered Dorothy. So there are some sort of strange or interesting points with this case. So number one, the caller sounded familiar. Number two, did Dorothy contact the caller before her disappearance? Was that what she was doing when she went to the toilet? Why did she change her scarf? Why did she swap from black to red? Why did she decide to walk out in the pitch black of night when she had this strange caller person making death threats to her? For me, if somebody was threatening to sort of get me alone and kill me, the first thing, or the first precaution that I would actually take on a day-to-day basis would be to make sure that I was never alone. So it is strange that Dorothy put herself in that position, but perhaps she was just such a lovely friend that she decided to risk everything so that her friend Conrad, who wasn't very well, didn't have to walk a distance to the car, which would just be obviously the most sad thing. It's also been debated that when the caller decided to contact the news to say that she cheated on him, it has been sort of discussed that this boyfriend or this person she cheated with could have been Conrad, and not that she was with him and not that they were together, but that the stalker could have seen the two together on the way to the hospital and at the hospital and assumed that they were together, and perhaps they were just so mentally unstable that they reacted in a way that unfortunately has left Dorothy's family without their daughter, without their mother, without a friend. Quite a possible answer or theory behind what has happened to Dorothy. So that's pretty much everything. It's strange because although it's a really talked about case, there were never really any leads, and people, I think, automatically assume that the strange caller was her murderer. Obviously it cannot be guaranteed, but that is probably the most likely theory or explanation behind her disappearance and her murder. Okay, so that's everything that I have to say on this case. It is a really heartbreaking case. She was just such a lovely person, and it's just such a shame that this happened to her. And so that's everything that I have on this case. It is such a sad, heartbreaking story to read up on, and it's just such a shame that there was actually no leads whatsoever and the family haven't got any justice. Hope you found this video interesting. Please do let me know what you think happened, or if you have read up on any more information that I haven't mentioned in this video. That would be amazing because I am just so interested in this case. So if you did enjoy the video, then please do give it a big thumbs up. Comment, as I mentioned, let me know your opinions, let me know your thoughts, or if you have any other cases that you would like me to research. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!